Crescent Hills was the kind of neighborhood where the air smelled faintly of lavender mulch and conformity. The sidewalks were pressure-washed weekly, and even the trees seemed trimmed into submission. But beneath the manicured lawns and pastel, shutters pulsed a quieter tyranny, one enforced with relentless fervor by the HOA president, Karen Mallory. Karen stood just over 5 feet tall, but carried herself like a queen in exile. Her kingdom, a 3-bedroom colonial, with a wraparound porch and an unobstructed view of her neighbors' every move. Her scepter, a stainless steel clipboard, always tucked beneath her arm. Her crown, a flawlessly highlighted bob that never strayed out of place. Even during surprise inspections, the residents whispered behind closed doors about the citations, the fines, the constant surveillance, but no one ever challenged her. It was easier to repaint a mailbox than endure Karen's crusade for order. So when a black Ford F-250 with county sheriff decals pulled into the neighborhood just after 9 p.m., parked on the street and stayed there, Karen saw not a civil servant returning home, but a flagrant violation of Rule 7.3.4, no street parking after 9 p.m. under any circumstance. Her eyes narrowed as she peered from behind her lace curtains. The truck was massive, caked in red dust, and sat like an uninvited guest in her pristine domain. She didn't check the plates, didn't notice the badge on the dash. To Karen, there were no exceptions. Rules were rules. Within minutes, she was on the phone with Eagle Tow Services. Repeat offender, she lied, dangerously obstructing the roadway. The tow truck arrived in less than 15. She watched from her front steps, arms folded, lips pursed in victory, as the sheriff's truck was hooked and hauled away into the night. What Karen didn't know, what she never bothered to learn, was that the truck belonged to Sheriff Hank Dawson, newly relocated from Westfield County with his teenage daughter, Emily. After losing his wife to cancer and surviving 15 years of high-risk law enforcement, he had finally decided to trade sirens and city chaos for the promise of a peaceful, suburban life. His daughter deserved a calm place to start over. He thought Crescent Hills was it. They'd arrived late, dusty from the long haul, and opted to settle in quietly. Emily had gone inside, while Hank parked on the street, temporarily, just for the night, intending to unpack tools from the back, before pulling into the narrow garage. But fatigue won, and now the truck was gone. The next morning, Hank stepped onto his driveway, coffee in hand, squinting in the sun as he realized something was wrong. The space where his vehicle had been was glaringly empty. He checked the street, walked to the end of the cul-de-sac, and scanned both directions. Nothing. A neighbor, a frail man in a windbreaker, walking a shivering chihuahua, offered a nod of sympathy. "You must be the new guy," he said. "Sheriff, right?" Hank nodded, jaw tightening. "Was parked right here last night." The man exhaled. "Karen had it towed. That woman doesn't sleep. You missed curfew by a few minutes. Karen, HOA president, lives in the blue house. Won't miss her. Front porch has about 9 security cameras and a gnome dressed like Napoleon." Hank's gaze followed the man's nod toward a home across the cul-de-sac. The blue shutters gleamed in the sun. A motion sensor clicked as he looked directly into the lens. Hank's jaw shifted. He wasn't a man who angered easily, but few things grated on him like unchecked authority, especially the kind that came wrapped in self-importance and laminate rulebooks. He didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to flash his badge. All he did was walk slowly back inside, place his coffee down on the kitchen counter, and open his laptop. He began typing. From the second-story window across the street, Karen Mallory watched him with a curious frown. She didn't yet realize what she'd done. but she would. Oh, she would. Karen Mallory awoke the next morning with a righteous glow. She had upheld the rules, her rules, and the sanctity of Crescent Hills was preserved. The sheriff's truck was gone, and in her mind, peace had been restored. She brewed a cup of jasmine tea, sat on her porch with her clipboard, and watched the neighborhood stir. The victory was short-lived. By 10 a.m., every mailbox on the block contained a notice, a formal memo from the office of Sheriff Hank Dawson, complete with county seal and official letterhead, to the residents of Crescent Hills. Due to a recent incident involving the unauthorized towing of a county-owned law enforcement vehicle, I will be conducting a full review of HOA policies in relation to municipal and state laws. I encourage any residents who have experienced similar issues to contact my office directly. Public servants are not exempt from courtesy or the law. Sincerely, Sheriff Hank Dawson. Karen read it twice, then a third time. Her face flushed. Her hands trembled. "He's threatening us," she whispered, as if the letter had personally insulted her hydrangeas. She stormed into her home office, knocking over a framed photo of her and her late husband at the HOA inauguration. The glass cracked across their smiling faces. Karen didn't notice. She fired off an email to the board. Subject line: Emergency HOA meeting. Sheriff threatens autonomy. Within the hour, 4 members crowded around her dining table, sipping coffee from HOA-branded mugs and nodding solemnly. "This is a direct attack on our authority," Karen declared. "He thinks just because he wears a badge, he can undermine our governance." Tom Alvarez, the treasurer, cleared his throat. "Technically, Karen, he is the law." Karen's eyes sliced toward him. "Not in Crescent Hills. Here, we maintain standards. I won't let some dusty, badge-waving cowboy tear that down." Murmurs of agreement followed, but they were half-hearted, nervous. The sheriff's letter had rattled them more than they admitted. Still, Karen thrived in the face of defiance. If anything, the challenge energized her. That afternoon, she doubled down. Hank's driveway was cited for staining inconsistent with neighborhood palette. His fence height was potentially non-compliant. A landscaping infraction was flagged. Possible unapproved flora. A fine of $275 was issued, citing unauthorized use of county vehicle on private roads. She printed it all, shoved it into a manila envelope, and walked across the street. The sheriff's daughter, Emily, answered the door. Teenage, maybe 16 or 17, with sun-streaked hair in a messy bun, and the tired eyes of someone who'd seen more grief than prom nights. She looked confused. "Can I help you?" Karen offered a smile so tight it cracked at the corners. "Just some official HOA materials for your father." "Okay," Emily said, taking the envelope. "He's working. Remind him the HOA's expectations are non-negotiable." Emily nodded slowly and shut the door. Back across the street, Karen strutted like she'd planted a flag on foreign soil. Inside, Emily placed the envelope on the kitchen table and returned to her textbook. 10 minutes later, her father came in. "More from the clipboard queen?" he asked, half smiling. Emily nodded. She came in person this time. Hank picked up the envelope, opened it, and leafed through the citations. He chuckled at the fence. Height 1. But when he reached the $275 fine, his smile faded. He set the papers down, leaned against the counter, and exhaled. "She doesn't know when to quit. You gonna do something?" Emily asked, trying to sound casual, but the edge in her voice betrayed her. Hank turned to her. She picked a fight with the law over a parked truck. Now she's targeting a family. "Yeah, I'm gonna do something, but not out of anger." We do this the right way." Emily didn't say anything, but the corners of her mouth lifted ever so slightly. Later that evening, Hank returned to his laptop. He began compiling records: Karen's public interactions with residents, archived complaints, the bylaws she cited most often. He sent a request for HOA registration documents from the county records office. He called in a few favors: former colleagues who now worked in legal affairs. Meanwhile, Karen was on a warpath. She patrolled twice as often, citing residents for everything from holiday flags to improperly trimmed hedges. When someone protested, she pointed to her clipboard and reminded them, compliance is community. But what she didn't notice, what she was too intoxicated by power to see, was the growing shift around her. The neighbors she'd once intimidated were beginning to whisper again, but louder this time. Conversations bloomed in driveways, at mailboxes, even at the park gazebo she'd once commandeered for an HOA-approved yoga class. People were talking, sharing stories, comparing finds, and they all led back to Karen. The sheriff hadn't just stirred the pot. He'd opened everyone's eyes to how long it had been boiling, and Karen, in her perfectly pressed slacks and polished smile, was too busy declaring war to realize her reign was starting to crumble. Sheriff Hank Dawson wasn't a man who rushed headlong into confrontation. Years in law enforcement had taught him the value of patience, the power of evidence, and the precision of timing. Karen Mallory had poked a bear she didn't understand, and now that bear was reading bylaws by the light of his desk lamp. By the start of the new week, Hank had assembled a tidy package. It included Crescent Hill's HOA charter, the original articles of incorporation, and a long list of complaints collected from neighbors, some recent, many dating back years. But the crown jewel was a revelation buried in the HOA's registration records. The association's annual renewal had lapsed 2 years ago. The HOA was no longer legally recognized, which meant Karen's rules, the citations, the fines, even the authority she wielded like a saber, all null and void. On Wednesday morning, Hank walked into the county clerk's office with everything in hand. 30 minutes later, he walked out with a notarized document declaring the Crescent Hills HOA in breach of municipal code. Then he filed a motion with the county board to suspend all HOA activity pending legal review. But he didn't stop there. He knew that justice wasn't just about paperwork. It was about the people. The neighbors who'd endured years of quiet resentment deserved to see the mask ripped away. So that evening, Hank printed copies of his findings, clear, digestible, and legally sound, and slipped them into every mailbox on the block. Notice: to residents of Crescent Hills. Due to procedural non-compliance and failure to maintain proper registration, the Crescent Hills Homeowners Association has lost its legal standing. All fines, citations, and restrictions issued by the current leadership are now unenforceable. Further HOA action may be subject to civil penalty. Sheriff Hank Dawson. The neighborhood buzzed like a disturbed hive. Doors opened. Residents stepped onto their porches, some in disbelief, others in elation. For the first time in years, they weren't afraid to speak openly. Tom Alvarez, the timid treasurer, was the first to flip. He emailed the entire board, citing Hank's findings, and officially resigned. "I didn't sign up for a dictatorship," he wrote, "nor to be sued." 2 more members followed suit. By sunset, Karen Mallory was down to a one-woman regime, and even she could feel it slipping. She paced her kitchen, the HOA bylaws spread out across her table like ancient scrolls. Her hands trembled as she dialed her lawyer. "I need you to dispute something. A sheriff's overreach." She snapped into the phone, but her attorney wasn't reassuring. "Karen," he said cautiously, "if the HOA lapsed its registration, you don't have a leg to stand on. If you've been issuing fines under false authority, you're at risk for liability. Potential class action." "I am the HOA," she barked. "You were," he replied. "Now you're just a neighbor." The words echoed like gunfire in an empty chamber. Across the street, Hank watched from his front porch. Not in triumph, but with the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd stood his ground. Emily sat beside him, cross-legged in a faded hoodie, sipping a soda. "You think she's gonna stop?" she asked. "She'll have to," he said. "The law doesn't bend to her." Clipboard. There was a long silence between them, the kind that held more weight than words. Finally, Emily whispered, "Mom would have liked it here." Hank nodded. "She would have baked cookies for the whole block. Even for Karen." Emily smirked. "Probably would have converted her." "Maybe," Hank chuckled. "Or at least taught her what actual community means." Just then, a knock echoed from the front door. Hank stood, half expecting Karen, but instead found 3 neighbors on the porch. One held a casserole dish. Another had a 6-pack of beer. The third, a retired veteran named Harold, just offered a firm handshake. "Thanks, Sheriff," he said simply. "For everything." More neighbors followed. Some came with baked goods, others with folded lawn chairs. In minutes, Hank's front yard had turned into an impromptu gathering. Laughing, venting, reconnecting. Years of tension melted away in the warm glow of porch lights and shared relief. Karen watched from behind her curtains. Her kingdom had moved on without her. Her phone buzzed. Another HOA resignation. She turned off the light. Across the street, Sheriff Hank Dawson lifted his beer in a quiet toast as the neighborhood, his neighborhood now, came back to life around him. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Karen wasn't known for surrender, and neither was the law. Karen Mallory hadn't left her house in 3 days. Gone were the days of her morning patrols, clipboard clutched like a scepter. The porch she once ruled from now sat empty, its flower boxes browning. Inside, she clung to remnants of power, drafting, memos, redlining bylaws, and updating an HOA website that no longer legally existed. She wasn't giving up. Not yet. In her mind, the sheriff had humiliated her, twisted her intentions into tyranny, and convinced her neighbors to betray her. She saw it all as an orchestrated coup, one she'd rectify. So, she called in a favor from her brother, a retired attorney with a chip on his shoulder and a Rolodex full of procedural loopholes. There must be something, she insisted. A technicality, a statute, anything that can invalidate his little crusade. Her brother did his best. He filed for a temporary injunction to halt Sheriff Dawson's order, claiming municipal overreach and harassment. It bought her 72 hours. Enough time, she thought, to rally support, rebuild her board, and remind Crescent Hills, who had built its reputation. She printed flyers. She sent emails. She scheduled an emergency restoration meeting at the community center. But the night of the meeting, only 4 people showed up. 2 were former board members, hoping to retrieve old records. The third was a curious newcomer who thought it was a bake sale. The fourth, Sheriff Hank Dawson. He sat at the back of the room, arms folded, a quiet wall of law in uniform. Karen stood behind the podium, voice trembling with artificial poise. "The HOA may have suffered a legal technicality," she said, "but community governance must prevail." Hank stood slowly. Karen, you fined veterans for flying the flag. Threatened single moms over playsets. Towed a sheriff's truck. Your governance wasn't service. It was control. She snapped. You think you're the hero. You undermined the very order that keeps Crescent Hills desirable. Without structure, this place falls apart. Hank stepped forward. Calm, collected. Structure isn't the issue. Abuse is. You made people afraid to live in their own homes. Karen's voice cracked. I was trying to maintain standards. And in doing so, he said, you broke trust. And the law. There was silence. The remaining audience, small as it was, began to see clearly. Karen hadn't been protecting the neighborhood. She'd been policing it for her own ego. The next day, Hank filed a formal report with the district attorney's office. It included documentation of unauthorized fines, misuse of HOA funds, and most damning, the illegal towing of a county-owned vehicle. Karen was served a notice of investigation. Publicly, she framed it as political persecution. Privately, she scrambled. Her savings dwindled. With mounting legal fees, her allies vanished. Even her brother stopped taking her calls. But Crescent Hills flourished without the HOA's chokehold. Fences got repainted in cheerful colors. Flower beds bloomed, untamed. Kids returned to the cul-de-sacs with skateboards and chalk. Neighbors helped one another paint decks, mow lawns, and rebuild what Karen's rules had eroded. Community. One sunny afternoon, Hank stood at the park pavilion, now open to everyone. The town had voted unanimously to dissolve the HOA permanently, and instead, form a voluntary neighborhood council. No fines, no enforcers, just people helping people. Emily helped set up for the community picnic. She was surrounded by new friends, laughter rising around her like a song. Hey, Dad, she said, holding up a tin foil tray. Potato salad or coleslaw? Coleslaw, he grinned. Definitely coleslaw. As the picnic bloomed into full swing, with music and shared dishes and stories of HOA horrors turned into punchlines, Hank took a quiet stroll to the edge of the park. There, across the street, Karen stood on her porch, arms folded, watching. She looked older, more brittle than before. Her kingdom was gone. Her clipboard was nowhere in sight. Hank nodded to her, a silent gesture of finality. She didn't nod back. She simply turned and went inside. And that was the end of her rule. No arrests were made, but restitution was required. Karen paid back nearly $12,000 in unlawful fines over the course of a year. She was barred from participating in any neighborhood governance for 5. Justice hadn't come with sirens. It had arrived with facts, with patience, and a community finally ready to speak up. Hank Dawson went back to being just the sheriff and just a neighbor. But the story of Crescent Hills, how a town freed itself from tyranny by clipboard, became a quiet legend. And when new families moved in and asked about the neighborhood's past, the old-timers would smile, lean in, and say, well, there was a Karen